This is a lesson revising Section A of Paper 2 from the new Edexcel 9:1 GCSE English Language Exams. In this lesson we're going to be revising the question types that appear in Section A of Paper 2 and how you should respond effectively to those in the exams. We'll begin with the short answer questions. Now, as you know, you have two texts on Paper 2. They are both non-fiction and they are both modern. You have 3 questions on text 1 and 3 questions on text 2. Questions 1 and 2 on text 1 and questions 4 and 5 on text 2 are the low scoring short answer questions. They are testing your scanning, skimming and information retrieval skills. They require nothing more than simple information retrieval. You just find the quote or the phrase and you present it on the paper. You don't have to give any detailed analysis, although in question 5 you might be presented with a quotation and just asked to explain the effect of it. But if you look at the space available, you can see they're not asking you to go into lots of detail for that one. So it is just about finding a specific piece of information on the exam, on the text, from the section that you are directed to. The answers you give to these questions need to be short. They need to be kept within the space provided. The exam board are deliberately restricting the amount of space you have to answer these because they're giving you a hint, a visual hint about how much they want you to write. So quite often all you need to provide for these is just a single word. Certainly in response to question 1 and question 4, that's very often the case. Okay, but you need to keep within the space provided. The number of marks for these questions and for all of the questions on the Edexcel exam papers indicate how long you should spend answering these questions. So for these ones, it's basically if there's 1 mark available, then just spend 1 minute answering. If there's 2 marks, just spend 2 minutes. So they're very, very low scoring. They need to be answered quickly. And all of these questions will direct you to a very specific section of the text. So make sure you highlight the line reference that you're being directed to and only provide answers from within that line reference. If you provide anything outside of the line reference, you will automatically score 0. Okay, let's take a look at those low scoring questions in a bit more detail now. Okay, let's begin by looking at questions 1, 2, 4 and 5. These 4 questions are low scoring questions. They only require a short form answer and they are testing your skimming and scanning skills. Questions 1 and 2 will always relate to text 1, the first non-fiction text that you have on the paper. Questions 4 and 5 will always relate to text 2, the second non-fiction text that you have on the paper. Let's look at questions 1 and 4. These 2 questions are very similar. If we look, they're low scoring. Question 1 is worth 2 marks and question 4 is worth 1 mark. The number of marks available is a good indication to you of the amount you are expected to write in response to this. If we look at question 1, it asks you to look specifically at lines 22 to 30, so it's directing you to a very specific part of the text, and to identify 2 requirements needed by people recruited by MI6. To get the 2 marks, you must identify those requirements, and all they are asking for in response to that is for you to write down 2 direct quotations. So they're testing your skimming skills to see whether you can identify the 2 quotes from that passage of the text that answer that particular question. When we come to question 4, again this is testing skimming skills. It's asking for a very specific piece of information. How many messages does Leo Marx have to decode? This is worth 1 mark. It therefore requires either a single phrase or a single word answer. Questions 1 and 2 do not require any explanations of the quotations or the references that you are using to answer those questions. They are testing skimming. Let's look now at question 2 and question 5. we can see that both questions are worded in a very similar way. Both questions are asking you to give one example, and both questions are directing you to a very specific part of each text. Okay, these two questions are testing your skimming and your scanning skills together. They require in response a direct quotation and a very brief explanation of how that quotation proves the point that they're making in the question. So if we take question 2, it's asking you to find one example from lines 1 to 8 of how the writer uses language to show how the recruitment process has changed. So the quotation that you give must show that there has been a change in the recruitment process at MI6, and you have to explain that very briefly. It's only worth 2 marks. They don't want an essay, they just want a sentence explaining it. Look at the amount of space there is there for you to write in. There isn't enough space for an essay. We look at question 5, again, give one example, this time from lines 6 to 8, and this is with text 2, of how Leo Marx uses language to show how difficult it was for him to break the code. So again, you will find a quotation that shows it was difficult for Leo Marx to break the code, and you will provide a sentence explaining why that particular quote shows that it was indeed difficult for him to break that code. So that's what's required. Let's look now at the correct answers to these 4 questions and see the sorts of answers that are required for each one of these questions. Okay, so here we can see the answers to the questions that we have just talked through. So if we look at the answers to question 1, this asked you to identify 2 requirements needed by people to be recruited by MI6 from lines 22 to 30 of text 1. The correct answers that would have got full marks were that they must be British and they must also hold a 2-2 degree or above. They are bits of information that have come directly from the text. You can see there is no explanation. It's just written as a statement. They are the features, the requirements needed to be recruited by MI6. If we look at question 4, the question that is testing skimming skills in relation to the second text, it asks how many messages does Leo Marx have to decode. This was worth 1 mark, and all that was required to get that mark was to write the number 3. You wouldn't have got that mark if you'd written it as a numeral, if you'd written the numeral 3, but if you write it as a word, if you write the word 3, as we can see here, you'd get the mark. So you can see they're very short form answers. They're questions that you should be answering relatively quickly in this exam paper. We go on to questions 2 and 5 now. So question 2 was asking for one example from lines 1 to 8 of how the writer was using language to show the changes in the recruitment process. So a correct answer would be that there is a demand for more women too. So that's the quotation, that's the skimming part, so they get a tick for that, they get 1 mark for that. And then they say that the writer is putting the exaggeration on women, implying that MI6's recruiting has changed on the amount of women they let in. So they get a tick for that as well, because they've explained why that particular quote is showing that there's been a change. They're recruiting more women. So they get 4 marks for that. When we come to question 5, this is requiring the same kind of response, but this time we're dealing with a particular section of text 2. So we're looking for one example from lines 6 to 8 of how language has been used to show that it was difficult for Leo Marx to break the code. And this person has written that the word unbreakable was used to show that it was impossible to decode. Okay, it's worth 1 mark. They're showing an understanding of that word unbreakable. They explain that it shows it was impossible to decode. They don't need to go into any more detail than that. That gets them the 1 mark. So you can see that these are questions requiring short answers. You don't need to go into any detail, but you do need to be answering them relatively quickly in the exam setting. Right, now we come on to question 3, which is the final question on text 1, and this question asks for detailed analysis of the effects of specific language and structural features within text 1. Okay, it is always going to ask you to analyse how language and structure have been used for a particular effect. So it's not enough just to be able to identify the language and structural features. You have to explain the effect they have in terms of conveying meaning and the writer's ideas and perspectives. You must comment and identify specific language and structural features to go beyond level 2. If you only comment and analyse language features, no matter how many you've got in there, you cannot progress beyond level 2 in the mark scheme. Equally, if you only talk about structural features and don't mention any specific language features, you will not get higher than level 2. So make sure you have a mixture of analytical comments on specific language features and specific structural features. In terms of analysis, this means zooming right down to word level, zooming into individual phrases and particular techniques. So really looking at the suggested meaning of particular words, thinking about why the writer is choosing specific devices and what effect they're hoping that's going to have on the reader. When you're analysing, the first stage obviously is to identify a specific technique and to provide a relevant quotation that illustrates that. But to get access to the higher marks, you have to go beyond just that identification. You have to explain how those features are being used for particular effects. So look at the wording of the question, look at the focus of the question, and make sure you're analysing the effect of the devices you're identifying in relation to whatever the question focus is. For question 3, there is an expectation that when you identify these language and structural features, you will use the correct technical term to do so. So wherever possible, use the correct term. So if it is, I don't know, if it is a phrase that you're referring to, look to see whether it is expressed in using an imperative or whether it's a question. Look at the particular types of words and sentences and techniques and use the right term to identify those. Your response to question 3 must be written as a PED essay, point, evidence, explanation and development. You should be very familiar with that format now. The fact that the question is worth 15 marks and the space that is available indicates to you that they want a PED essay for that. And as always, it's a mark a minute, so here you have 15 marks available, so you should be spending 15 minutes providing your response to question 3. Let's take a look now in a bit more detail at the wording and the structure of question 3. So if we look at question 3 then, this is the one that is asking for an essay response to a particular aspect of the first text. And the wording of these questions is very typical. This is the sort of wording that you can expect in the mocks that you do on this course and when you come to do the exam for real. So question 3 asks you to analyse how the writer uses language and structure to interest and engage readers, and you are told to support your views with detailed reference to the text. So if we pick that question apart, we've got some key words in there. The word analyse is indicating to you that you are being asked to write in PED paragraphs. You're being asked to look beyond the obvious meanings. Another key word is language, so you're being asked to focus on language devices that are being used. And also another word is structure. Structure doesn't just mean the order in which the information is presented. It means the way that language is used to tie the text together so that it feels cohesive. So are there things mentioned early on that are then picked up on later in the text? Is there a particular image that is developed through the text or a particular idea? You're being asked to analyse the way that those language and structural features are being used to interest and engage, so to keep the reader's interest, make them want to read this text. And you are told directly to support your views with detailed references to the text. That means direct quotations, and that needs to be done in the form of a series of PED paragraphs. Let's turn now to question 6. Again, this is worth 15 marks and requires a planned and structured essay. This time the wording of the question is slightly different. it tells you that Leo Marx attempts to engage the reader through the description of his relationship with the girls. Evaluate how successfully this is achieved. Support your views with detailed reference to the text. So what you're being asked to do is to give an opinion of how well the writer manages to hold the reader's interest through the description of the relationship with the girls. Again, you are told to support your views with detailed references to the text, so that is a reminder to you that you are writing an essay and it should be written in a series of linked P2 paragraphs with embedded quotations. These two questions are very typical. You will always get one of these questions that asks you to evaluate, that asks you to give your opinion of how well the writer has achieved a particular thing in the text, and you will always be asked in the other question to analyse, to write a standard essay looking at a particular feature of language in relation to a particular aspect of the text. So they're the typical kinds of questions that you get in question 3 and question 5, both worth 15 marks, both require an essay response. Let's look now at some responses that scored full marks, a level 5. So here we have a high scoring response to question 3 that we've just been talking about, the one that asks for an analysis of the writer's use of language and structure to interest and engage the reader. This person scored 14 of the possible 15 marks, and that gave them a level 5. Remember, you will need to be performing at level 5 to be considered to have gained a good pass on these exam papers. So this is the sort of response that you need to be aiming for when you're answering this kind of question on this paper. So if we look at the beginning, this person has said that the writer has used varied sentence structure to keep the reader engaged. So straight away, they're into language features and also structure as well, because they're talking about the sentence structures. They're using the keywords of the question. They then develop that by talking about different sentences. They talk about advanced, I'm not quite sure what an advanced sentence is, but a complex sentence. And they talk about the use of punctuation. They then go on to talk about the way that the reader is engaged, okay, and that the writer is focused on engaging the reader and does this through mocking stereotypes. So this is a feature that they're using, that the writer's using, that they've picked up on. They then go on to talk about these intertwined personal stories, and this is a structural device, the way that these personal stories are not set out separately, but they're intertwined within the text. And they've got lots of nice short embedded quotes there. They're writing in linked PED paragraphs, and they have primary and secondary quotations. So they make their point, they include their primary quotation, they then explain it, and then they develop that point by adding a secondary quotation and explaining that in detail. Now, when the examiners marked this, they felt this was a very good focused response to this. And what the examiners said in response to this was that this answer was demonstrating an analysis of language at level 5 throughout. At the start of this response, they are exploring structure, but it wasn't developed. They didn't go on and develop it and show enough understanding of the way that structure was being used. They show discrimination in their choice of examples, so their choice of quotations is very good, and they're able to comment on the use of language. There is some exploration of the effect of language, but again, that's a little bit sort of fleeting, a little bit superficial. They could have gone into a bit more detail. But the examiner felt that overall there was enough analysis and discriminating use of direct quotations to achieve the middle of a level 5. To improve, this person needed to include more development of the analysis, a more explicit analysis of structure, which would have pushed their mark up. So they've done very well, but they could have done better. This is the kind of response that you need to be providing when you're answering a question 3 style question. Right, now we focus our attention on question 6. This is the final question on text 2. This one is always going to ask you to evaluate the presentation of the theme in text 2. Okay? Evaluation means zooming out. So whereas analysis for question 3 was zooming in, for evaluation we need to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. We need to take a critical overview of the effectiveness of the text as a whole. So do not zoom in and comment at word level, at sentence level, at individual device level. That is not the correct way to answer this question. You need to maintain that overview, that broad critical judgment of the text as a whole. What you should be doing, however, is always explaining how successfully or convincingly or persuasively the writer has presented whatever aspect of sight you have been asked to evaluate in the question. Okay, so make sure you've identified that in the question. You are reminded in the wording of the question to use textual references, so make sure you support your evaluation. So every time you offer an opinion, so the point at the beginning of your paragraph, you then need to provide some evidence from the text to show why you are forming that opinion, why you think it's successful, and a bit of evidence to show that aspect in action within the text. Don't try to be too detailed in your evaluation. Remember, it's a broad overview, it's a critical judgment. You're being asked to be a literary critic, essentially. And make sure you keep your evaluation within the space provided. Okay, again, with these questions, they give you the amount of space they expect you to be able to write in. You don't have to fill the whole space, but you certainly should not be going over the space that they've provided for you on the question. As with question 3, question 6, because it is a longer evaluative response, they are giving you 15 marks, so you have 15 minutes to answer that question. Okay, so now let's look at question 6 in a little more detail. Let's look now then at the good answer to question 6. This is the one that asks for an evaluation, so asking for your opinion, the candidate's opinion of how successful Leo Marx has been in terms of engaging the reader. And they're looking at that. They're looking at a particular aspect of that. They're looking at his description of his relationship with the girls. Again, this was a high scoring, a level 5 response. This is the kind of response that you need to be giving when you're answering these sorts of questions. Okay, so straight away there is focus on the question that's been set. Leo Marx creates the idea that the girls are a fearful entity. Alright, so this person is showing that they've understood what they're being asked to focus on, and they're beginning to explore and evaluate how that is being presented. They're talking about the way that Leo Marx puts forward the idea of being respectful to the work towards the girls, almost like the idea of him being too scared to name them because of their power. And they then talk about how that engages the audience. They go on to talk about the way that throughout this extract, the reader sees that Leo is under a lot of pressure to give the girls what they need to get on with breaking the code. They come with their German dictionaries to help them, but he is not able to. Leo presents the idea that the girls are more intelligent than he is by describing what he thinks they feel than rather what they actually feel. Okay. Remember, this question was asking about Leo Marx's description of his relationship with the girls, and it's also asking for the opinion of the candidate, and that's what we're seeing here. This is their interpretation of his presentation of this relationship. They then give some direct evaluation. Leo Marx is successful in engaging the reader because... Okay, so they are answering that question directly. They are evaluating, they're making a value judgment about how well he's done it, and they're focusing on the question, which was how well he'd engaged the reader. So that's going to get them quite a lot of marks there. It goes on in the same sort of vein, and they remain focused on this relationship. They keep referring to the way that it engages the reader and makes the reader want to read on and actually sort of empathise with Leo Marx as well. So when the examiners came to mark this one, they said that in this response there's an evaluation of the ideas in the text, as we've been discussing. So they talk about the ideas. There's also an evaluation of the events, where the candidate talks about one particular event, which is the trial to solve the codes and the girl's reaction to him. This answer, therefore, shows a sustained and detached critical overview of the text. And that's important. It is sustained and it is critical. You're being asked to give an opinion as to how good this text is, effectively. So you're acting as a critic. You're critiquing this text. And there is some discriminating use of references to support the points being made. They say that this is a detailed evaluation of how the purpose of conveying the relationship is achieved. So they've done very well with this. So now we come to the final question on paper 2 section A, which is question 7. This is the comparative question, and it is split into 2 parts. Part A is always going to ask you to compare just the similarities, not the differences, nothing like that at all. Just look for what is the same and look for the most obvious similarities. The focus will always be the similarities of subject, ideas, events or things, and you will have one of those specified in the question. So identify that in the question before you go back and find your examples from the 2 texts. You're being asked to compare content, so what is similar, not technique. You're not being asked to compare how they're similar, you're just being asked to compare broadly what is similar. So it's just seeing whether you can take 2 texts on the same theme and identify points of similarity. All right, we're not getting into the writer's techniques or language features or anything complicated like that. In terms of your response, as you know, you are supposed to provide 3 separate paragraphs, 1 for each of the 3 similarities that you identify. There are 6 marks on offer here. You get 2 marks for each paragraph that you are able to present effectively, and your paragraph should be structured as follows. The first sentence should just state the general similarity, so that becomes your topic sentence. You use some comparative language in there. You then provide some textual evidence from text 1, which could be a direct quote, it could be paraphrasing, or it could be a reference. You then use a comparative connective to introduce the textual evidence from text 2. And that is it. It is as simple as that. And they just want 3 of those chunks, 3 of those paragraphs. You get 2 marks for each one that you provide successfully. Just be careful that you are not providing the same similarity 3 times with 3 different sets of evidence. That is a fairly common mistake that people make. Make sure they are 3 different similarities from the text. Again, your answer must remain in the space provided on the exam paper, and you have less than 1 side of A4 to provide this response. So they're helping you out. They're showing you that they don't want PED essays or anything like that. They're not looking for a PED essay for this one. And again, a mark a minute. So this time there are 6 marks on offer. So 6 minutes for answering this question. Let's look at question 7A, and let's look at what a good high scoring response should look like. So here is the response, and you can see just by glancing at it that the 3 paragraphs are all separate. Let's get into the details of this. So the first thing to notice is that the topic sentences of each paragraph start with the word both. That signals to the examiner that you are considering both of the texts. It then goes on to state the similarity of site. It uses the keyword of the question. So if you look, each of these paragraphs has got the word expedition, and if you look back at the question, you can see that what you're being asked to compare is the events that happen on the expedition. All right, so that appears in the topic sentence, and that's saying to the examiner that you've read and understood what you're being asked to compare in this question, and you're providing relevant responses. The similarity in each paragraph is a general one. So in paragraph 1, we've got the fact that both of the expeditions were well planned. in paragraph 2 we've got an event, something gets trapped, something happens, and then again in paragraph 3 the similarity is a general one of an idea, the sense that both explorers feel a sense of failure and frustration. Okay, so what we haven't got there are similarities of specific language and structural devices, such as emotive language or three-part lists or complex sentences. We're dealing with general big aspects of sight, so subject matter, ideas, themes and events. After we've stated the general similarity, we then start by providing some evidence from text 1. So we state text 1. You need to clearly indicate to the examiner which text you're writing about, and you can do that either by saying text 1, writing text 1 as I've done in the first 2 paragraphs, or by naming the writer of one of the texts, because then the examiner knows which one that you're referring to. You then provide your textual evidence, and you can see that in the first 2 paragraphs that textual evidence comes in the phrase in the form of references and paraphrasing, and in the final paragraph there is a short direct quotation embedded into the sentence itself. We then need a comparative connective to signal that we're moving on to text 2, so we've got similarly and likewise, and then in the middle paragraph we've got the word and that suggests that text 2 is doing the same thing. So that signals that the focus is shifting to the second text. Again, you need to refer directly to the text, either by naming it as text 2 or naming the writer, so that the examiner is clear that you're talking about the other text. And you then need to provide your evidence, which again can be either direct quotation, paraphrasing or referencing. Okay, so you can see the way that that is working in there, and the key things with this are that there is no explanation of the effect of the evidence provided. You're not writing P paragraphs, this is testing skimming, scanning and information retrieval. It's not testing reading for meaning, it's not testing inferential thinking, so you don't need to explain the effect of any of the evidence that you provide. Things to note about this are that the paragraphs are not linked to one another in any way. However, the paragraphs are written in full sentences and continuous prose. It is not acceptable to simply provide a bullet point list response to this. The examiners do expect to see responses written in full sentences and in continuous prose. Okay, so it is a quick question to answer. It does need to be just retrieval of information and showing that you've understood the general similarities, but please do not write bullet point lists of quotes or use subheadings for each of the texts. Okay, we'll turn our attention now to part B of question 7. Part B is always going to require you to comment on similarities and differences, and it is the word compare in the question that indicates that to you. All right, it is not going to say comment on the similarities and differences. You are expected to know that that is what is required from the word compare in the question. The focus will always be the similarities and differences in the ideas and perspectives of the two writers in reaction to a particular aspect of sight that they are both dealing with. That will tend to be one of the main themes, but it could be a particular event, or it could be their subject matter that they're writing about. So what you're being asked to do is to write about how the writers of these two texts view their subject matter, their theme or a particular event in similar ways, and also how they differ at some points. You're being asked to compare how. So this time you are being asked to look at the writer's techniques. And again, there is an expectation that you will identify specific language and structural devices being used in these two texts and explain the effect of those in terms of showing us the writer's ideas and perspectives. So basically their thoughts and feelings. What do they think about the thing they're writing about, and how do they feel about it? How can we tell that from their language choices and their structural choices? you have to provide those analytical comments on the effects of specific language and structural devices, as you did in response to question 3. Part B of question 7 is basically pulling together all of the reading for meaning skills that you've already used in question 3 and question 7, and asking you to use those to present a comparative response which analyses and evaluates. So you're having to draw on both of those skill sets to be able to answer Part B effectively. Your response to Part B must be a PED essay, but in terms of structuring these PED essays, it's a little bit easier for Part B of question 7, because you, in your topic sentence, you identify a similarity or difference, you provide evidence from text 1, you then explain how that evidence is revealing an idea or a thought or a feeling of the writer of text 1, and then in terms of the development, you use a connective which either compares or contrasts, depending on whether you're looking at a similarity or difference. You provide some evidence from text 2, and then you explain how that evidence is revealing the thoughts and feelings of the writer of text 2 and how it compares or contrasts to the one that you provided from text 1. So the structuring of these PED essays is a little bit easier. Again, a mark a minute. This question is worth 14 marks, so you have 14 minutes to answer Part B. Let's look now at Part B in a little bit more detail. Right, let's have a look at what an effective 7B PED paragraph looks like. This is the start of a response to 7B, so this isn't a whole response, but it's enough to give you a flavour of the kind of thing that you need to be providing. So the first thing to notice is that there is an introductory paragraph to this, because it is a formal essay, and that introductory paragraph summarises the way that the two texts present the shared theme. And the shared theme is a change of circumstances. That comes from the question. Remember to highlight and identify the keywords in the question so that your response is relevant to the question that has been set. We've referred to text 1 in there, and we've referred to text 2. Okay. When we get into the analytical PED paragraphs, you will notice that the PED paragraph starts with the word both, just like we did in response to 7A. The reason for doing this is that that signals to the examiner that you are comparing, you are considering both of these texts. Okay, and we're making a point here about a very specific language device. So we're writing about the tone, we're writing about humour, and we're suggesting that that's created through the use of colloquialisms. Okay, so we're using technical terminology, which is a requirement for this question, and we're being very specific and identifying specific language devices. We then provide some evidence from text 1, and again you need to make it clear which text you're writing about, so it's a good idea to use the term text 1 and text 2 or refer to the writers. The evidence in this case is a direct quotation which is short and has been embedded into the writing. And when we talk about embedding quotes, what that means is providing a short quotation that becomes part of the sentence. It doesn't interrupt the flow of the sentence, it doesn't trip up the meaning of the sentence, and you don't need to separate it from your own writing. It just literally embeds in and becomes part of what you're writing. Having provided that direct quotation, we then go on to give an explanation of the way that that piece of evidence is revealing the writer's perspective at this particular point. Okay, so we're commenting on the effect, we're showing an understanding of the effect of this particular device in this particular text to convey a specific writer's ideas and perspectives about this subject matter. All right, it is not enough just to identify examples of language and structural devices and talk generally about how those devices are used by any writer in any text. You have to be discriminating and focus on the way it's being used in the text you're dealing with. We then use a comparative connective. In this case, we're looking at something that's the same, so we're looking at similarities. So we've used the comparative connective similarly, Again, this is just signposting. This is what we refer to as signposting. So use of these words like both and the text, naming the text, and these comparative connectives signpost the examiner through your response. They can see that you're consistently comparing and contrasting. We then refer directly to text 2. So again, another signposting to help the examiner out. And we refer, using the technical term, to the language device that we are writing about within this P paragraph. So this is showing the examiner that we are maintaining focus. We are still writing about the use of colloquialisms. We then give some evidence, again in the form of a very short quotation which is embedded, which helps to develop the point that humour is injected into what is otherwise quite a formal text through the use of these colloquialisms. And that explanation forms the end of the P paragraph. So in terms of how that breaks down, so the point is a similarity of specific language feature here, then some evidence from text 1, comparative connective, reference to text 2, evidence from text 2, and then an explanation of how that evidence is working within text 2. So you can see that the response to 7b needs to be much more detailed. It needs to be more technical in terms of the language you use and the effects that you are analysing in response to that. So 7a is testing skimming, scanning and information retrieval, and they're the same skills that are tested in the low scoring, the 1 and 2 mark questions on the paper. You just have to find some evidence and provide it. 7b is testing the skills that are assessed in question 3 and question 6. So analysis, the ability to identify and comment analytically on the effect of specific devices, and also the ability to evaluate, to take a broad overview. Alright, so that is how you go about answering question 7, part A and part B.